And this is the gender panel of this year. So to situate this, you are at CPDP. Every year we have a so-called gender panel. It means that I'm given a chance to organize a panel where we will discuss gender. It doesn't mean that you cannot discuss gender in other panels. That is fine, but in case people forget about gender, we have a special gender panel. This year, the title of this panel is Will the Digital Ever Be Non-Binary? The Future of Trans Data Rights. I will just say a very, very few words on why this subject and what are we planning to do here. So the conference is about privacy and data protection. These are human rights, fundamental rights. It means they have to be for everybody, for everyone. And then to really understand what it means to have rights for everyone, it means that we remember about gender. And this is what we are trying to do. So it's about rights, data protection, privacy, gender. But I think a key element of this design of this panel here is that we cannot really discuss rights, the rights to privacy, to data protection, and gender, if we don't discuss more theoretical discussion or more deeper discussion or somehow parallel discussion about categorization, about this category of gender. If you think about this and think about this 1 second, it's one of the most fascinating categories that we have in our society. Many things are structured by this category of gender, and it's such a strange category. It's a vaporous category. It's also like a very physical category. It is structured by law, by technology, by many things. So how does this work? I will not tell you. We have here 4 great experts that will tell us more things about this category of gender and the ways in which it operates and the relation with non-binary and trans individuals. So who do we have here? I have to say, I don't like to say bad things about other panels, but we have a panel with only 4 new speakers. 4 new speakers, so no people that you have seen many, many times. No, in this panel, no. Only people who are here at CPDP for the first time, so that's very, very great. But in addition to be new, there are also great speakers. So we have first, in order of speaking, we have Alex Hanna. She used to be at Google. Nobody's perfect, But good news, no longer at Google, and now with Distributed AI Research Institute, Director of Research. So perhaps an applause is possible, yes. Good. Thank you very much. Second is Jens Thielen. So I have to say, I'm very, very thankful to Jens. We met preparing a specialist on feminist data protection, and actually became, I think, together with this idea of having a panel about trans rights. And I think it's great to have ideas, but the difficult part is actually to believe in this idea for long enough to see this happen. And it was really thanks to Jens that this worked. So thank you very much. You are also an expert on trans rights and human rights and critical thinking about human rights. So an applause for Jens, please. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So third, in an order of appearance, we have Kevin Guyan from the University of Glasgow. And I have to say, I'm also very happy to welcome you. Kevin is the author of this book. Have you read this book? If not, you can go and buy it. I think there are still some copies in the pop-up bookstore. It's really a great book, I would say. If you have read Feminist Data, have you read Feminist Data? It's even better than Feminist Data, I would say. Because, yes, I think I would say this. And it's really great. And the great thing, of course, is that when we decided to invite Kevin, we had not read his book at all, but we are like knowing in advance that it will be a great book, and it is a great book, so we are very happy with this. That was a great book, and we will probably discuss this a bit more. So, an applause for Kevin, yes. Good. And last, in order of appearance, Kirsty English. Kirsty is also at the University of Glasgow, and actually they are working on preparing questions to get data from people, actually, a strange thing. Questions to ask, sensitive questions for people, so how do we do this properly? Should we be doing this? So many practical questions and very, very interesting insights. So please, an applause for Kirsty, and I will shut up, I promise. Okay. Thank you very much. We will just, I give you the floor, and then we will have hopefully also a discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Gloria. I should say that, at Google, I was on the precipice of being fired, so it's fine. So today I want to really set the stage here and talk a little bit about framing the discussion. I'm going to talk about this a bit more abstract way and using the tool, kind of theoretical toolkit of several different scholars, mainly thinking about the work of Dean Spade and administrative violence. And talking about the tension that's involved in collecting data on trans and gender non-binary and gender non-conforming people. You go to the doctor's office, you buy an airline ticket, you go to the DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, you're asked to fill out a form which asks for a common set of information, name, age, gender, insurance policy number, employer's name and address. In many cases, each piece of this information may be rote, at worst annoying, but for those who move through the world in the most marginalized bodies, people who are black, brown, undocumented, unhoused, unemployed, disabled, and/or transgender and gender nonconforming, filling out these documents means making a commitment to categorization, which may contribute to serious harms on their person and livelihood. Practice and routines which are typically considered banal, bureaucratic and administrative records, reduce the life chances for those of us who are already marginalized by structural racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, and ableism. The term administrative violence, coined by legal scholar Dean Spade, refers to the harms created by forcing oneself into narrow categories of gender for the purpose of having one's basic needs met, due to the constraints and understandings of being the administrative subject by governments, welfare agencies, and healthcare organizations. Gender is only one of the categories we try to fit ourselves into. Any given paper forces transgender people to write a name they may not use in everyday life and which may not match their birth certificate. That form may also force someone who is unhoused to list an address at which they're staying temporarily, or someone who is undocumented to pause and wonder how and if they should disclose that fact. Administrative violence becomes peaked for trans and gender nonconforming people and can be especially harmful to trans people of color, especially trans women of color. This typically occurs at the level of identity documents, sex-segregated facilities, and healthcare access. In the U.S. context, rules for changing identity documents have inconsistent rules across municipalities and states, and are becoming more strict as a progression of conservative backlash to the possibility of transgender kids progressing through their own transitions limits their opportunities. Some of these rules require a doctor's notes, while some require surgery and certification from another authoritative body, and these just changed so frequently within U.S. Jurisdictions. This results in a web of confusing twists and turns, looping back to other agencies with no uniform method of updating documents. Indeed, Spade outlines this with an example of this kind of morass. Quote, one person born in New York and living in New York might have a birth certificate she cannot change from M to F because she has not had genital surgery, a driver's license that correctly reflects F because she got a doctor's letter, social security records that say M because she cannot produce evidence of surgery, a name change order that shows her new feminine name, and a Medicare card that reads F because the agency had no official policy and the clerk felt the name change order and the driver's license were sufficient. Administrative violence further acts at the level of sex-segregated facilities. Misclassification of trans people, especially trans women, limits their ability to access care facilities such as homeless shelters and drug rehabilitation centers. This often places trans women into men's facilities, placing them in situations in which they face disproportionate levels of violence from both residents and staff. Trans people also encounter administrative violence at the level of healthcare, where misclassification based on one's sex assigned at birth and/or the diagnosis of being trans at all can deny trans people the care for common gender and affirmation medications and procedures. It's sort of a joke within the trans community of, you can't receive care for a broken arm because you're broken arm while trans. On surveillance, the student of a computer science professor interested in training a facial recognition model came across a series of videos in which trans YouTubers documented their transition on the platform. As a quote-unquote edge case in the machine learning task, they gathered these videos en masse. The motivation for this project was to understand, quote, what kind of harm can a terrorist do if they understand that taking this hormone can increase their chances of crossing over into a border that's protected by facial recognition, end quote. This is a direct quote from this professor. Trans bodies and lives are continually held in suspicion. The professor in question framed the transition videos, which are often tools for self-expression and motivation for others, to be a vector for potential terrorists and cross-border subversion. In this context, the suspicion of the trans body becomes especially peaked for undocumented trans people and trans people of Arab, Indian, and Central Asian descent. The process of administrative violence should not be characterized as simply one of category error, in which correct classifications can be updated by administrative remedy. It is not a matter of ensuring that identity documents are harmonized across bureaucracies and organizations. Administrative violence occurs more frequently as surveillance infrastructures become more entrenched. And this is not just by the state, but also considering across corporate entities. The elimination of surveillance of queer bodies cannot be overlooked in the types of politics which aim to ameliorate administrative violence. As Spade continues, quote, a critical understanding of surveillance allows us to avoid making simplistic demands to have these policies fixed so that trans people can be more accurately classified. Rather, this analysis allows for the emergence of politics and resistance strategies that understand the expansion of identity verification as a key facet of racialized and gendered maldistribution of security and vulnerability. To put it simply, fixing identity documents will typically only benefit those trans people who are already well served by other administrative structures, typically those who are white, wealthy, and have access to medical procedures which comport them with an ideal trans subject. Lastly, on systems and legibility, considering the harms caused by misclassification is a path that has been well trodden by much of the discussion in the AI community on algorithmic fairness. This conversation typically has revolved around correcting for disparate error rates across different racialized and gender groups. However, as others have pointed out, this discussion typically grounds itself in frameworks which rely on the individualist focus on U.S. anti-discrimination law and the treatment of both advantaged and disadvantaged groups as equally needing of remediation. The problem isn't about fairness, but instead a state that rationalizes individuals in such a way to make them legible for surveillance over policing, medical gatekeeping, and denial of housing and employment. The state itself operates in such a way that collects data on individuals and uses automated tools which aren't structured for the benefit of the most marginalized. States aim to make legible those who live within their borders, that is, to make data from those for the purpose of sorting and categorizing them. And so this is well documented in the US in the case of welfare recipients in the states of Indiana, Child Protection Services in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and Eubanks, Virginia Eubanks documents this failure of the welfare systems. But what would the fixing of data classification schemas look like in a state which supported the most marginalized? Eubanks argues, in a system dedicated to supporting poor and working class people's self-determination, such diligence would guarantee that they attain all the benefits they're entitled to by law. However, under current regimes of data collection and attempted harmonization, in the shadow of surveillance and anti-trans conservative politics, such diligence pushes trans people to find methods of hiding their transness or identifying alternative means to health and welfare. The effort of, quote, more inclusive data sets and data input fields, unquote, as Anna Lauren Hoffman puts it, quote, are billed as progress or doing better implicitly, and those implicitly concede the harms inflicted by their less intrusive iterations, while celebrating narrow technical updates as a kind of victory for marginalized communities. So to wrap up, I want to situate the current discussion that we're having today at this conference of the collection of data on transgender lives. The data collection on transgender and gender nonconforming people, especially those who are racialized, is a reflection of, as Ruha Benjamin has stated, citing Alondra Nelson, a dialectic of neglect and surveillance at work, so that being included is not simply positive recognition, but can be a form of unwanted exposure. This uneasy tension pushes us to ask, what is the function of transgender data, who's collecting it, and who does it serve? Geography scholar Avery Everhart frames the collection of transgender data as a means of harm reduction, an emergency mitigation that serves as a means of redress in a world of transphobia, transmisogyny, and transmisogynoir. But we should also recognize to what degree that resistance of transgender data collection are a means of survival, following Blue Buchanan operating as a type of fugitive undercommons. So we should sit with and work through this tension, and I hope we can use the rest of this panel to this end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Jens directly.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here, and especially on such a superstar panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about categorization. It's going to be a little bit abstract, but I think we can perhaps understand it as one aspect of administrative violence, although also no more than that. It's something that struck me when thinking about the topic of our panel, trans data, how incredibly broad it is, already in terms of the examples that come to mind, like automated gender attribution, population-wide surveys like the Census, the never-ending example of airport scanners, and so on and so forth. And I think what they all have in common, though, is that they involve some form of gendered classification. My own disciplinary background is in human rights law, where the paradigmatic example of trans rights is legal gender recognition. So the right to change the legal gender that you were assigned at birth. Law is obviously central here, but just as obviously, although human rights law doesn't tend to think about it in those terms, this is a case of trans data. You have data points on gender and potentially on gender history, which are collected in your birth certificate or the civil registry, and then processed again and again over a wide range of contexts, driver's licenses, university enrollment, health insurance cards, and so on. The work of Mar Hicks on what they call a prehistory of algorithmic bias has been particularly clear in kind of connecting the dots here between law, data, gender, and categorization. They describe how the computer systems introduced by the UK Ministry of Pensions in the 1970s played a critical role in constructing certain identities as normative, and, as they put it, reifying binary gender and strengthening the fiction of gender as an unchanged and unchanging category. All this is to say that gendered categorizations within data and within law might be one fundamental aspect of trans existence. Susan Stryker defines the very concept of transgender as the movement across a socially imposed boundary away from an unchosen starting place. And it's hardly surprising then that categorization keeps recurring over the course of that movement. So because of this, I'd like to dwell a little bit on categorization and how it relates to trans data. It's worth emphasizing, I think, that neither law nor data processing simply reflect some kind of pre-given reality in their categorizations. They contribute to shaping reality by picking up and re-signifying some elements and ignoring or reclassifying others. When I was preparing this presentation, I dithered for a moment on whether I should even mention this, because I think it's become kind of a trite point at this point. We all know that there is no raw data as such. Data is not the new oil, it's not a natural resource, because there are no natural resources, only aspects of nature that get turned into resources through extraction and commodification. But this point still seems to get lost when we're talking about data related to gender, presumably because gender itself is conceived of as somehow natural, inherent, or essential. Once we admit that gender too is culturally constituted, it becomes very clear that trans data is not a given, but rather contributes to shaping what it merely purports to describe. One way that people have tried to grapple with this process is by understanding it as a process of translation. So, for example, Jeffrey Allen Johnson, in an article published in the Transgender Studies Quarterly, speaks of translation regimes as the socio-technical process through which data systems interpret and construct the world. And in Kevin's recent book, Queer Data, which I had to find an excuse to mention because it is in fact brilliant and you should read it, he also emphasizes that the census is a translation of the social world rather than a carbon copy. And this process of translation often involves becoming intelligible to cis people. At the superficial level, because it's often cis people who design data systems and enact laws pertaining to trans people, but also in a more structural sense because of how gender is socially constructed as binary with cis personhood as the norm and non-binary and trans subjects as a deviation from that norm. So in light of this, we might perhaps think of this kind of categorization not so much as translation, but rather as cislation, becoming readable and intelligible to cis people. And the term cislation is not mine. It's borrowed from a brilliant piece by trans scholars T.J. Jurian and Z. Nicolazo entitled "Not Another Gender Binary, A Call for Complexity Over Cis Readability." And they describe the practice of cislation. All of these are going to be quotes from throughout their piece, as the translating of seemingly illegible, not understandable genders for cis recognition, or as what happens when trans people feel compelled to create narratives about our transness in the simplest, most reductive of terms. Cislation in this way signals cisgender people's lack of understanding and the omnipresence of a cultural gender binary discourse through which we, as trans people, must wade. End quotes. So, for example, non-binary people are obviously unintelligible within the gender binary and must be cislated as male or female accordingly, like when Twitter categorizes me as male, although I literally have they, them pronouns in my Twitter bio. But there are also more complex iterations of this. To give just one more example, German law now has the option for a gender marker besides male and female, and again, I would think of this as a form of trans data. So there is a non-binary option, but the preconditions for accessing this particular marker make it very clear that it's still premised on making sense before the law to cis people on a very particular understanding of gender, which requires some kind of stability, coherence, in order to become, to be considered legitimate. What does all this tell us about trans data and about categorizations in and through data and in and through law in general? One of the questions that we posed ourselves in the blurb for this panel was, do we need less data, more data, or different data? And I'd like to end by considering that question for a moment, although, of course, the answer will always depend on context, and I think both Kevin and Kirsty are going to speak to that in different ways in a moment. But one general point might be, when we need data at all, we often need more complex data than is usually accounted for. Jurian and Nicolazo and their piece on cislation with a call to embrace complexity over a false sense of readability of trans realities. Translation into data may be necessary or even welcome in some cases, only in some cases, but we can try to avoid cislation. And when we reach the point where the reduction of complexity seems inevitable, we can pause to ask ourselves whether it really is inevitable, who is setting the standards of that ostensible inevitability, and who is profiting or losing out from setting those particular standards. And this is very much not to say that more complex data is always good. Quite to the contrary, like Alex was just saying, it's not just a case of a category error. My sense is that in many cases, this kind of questioning will actually lead to a position of refusal, so less data in some cases. An easy example case in that regard is automatic gender attribution. And again, I need to come back to Alex, who has recently co-authored a really cool article which describes it as a form of auto-essentialization. So reinscribing essential notions of difference, in this case, notably the gender binary and its colonial genealogy. I think this is a very apt description, and it makes clear that automated gender attribution goes about reducing complexity in a very blunt way, and certainly not for emancipatory ends. Oz-Keys has put it like this: there is simply no way to make a technology premised on external inference of gender compatible with trans lives. Its very premise is rooted in cislation, would be another way of putting it, and refusal and resistance are therefore the only apt response. Of course, there are other cases which will be less clear-cut, not least because some form of cislation may be necessary in the end to our very survival. With legal categorizations in particular, we often don't have a choice about data being processed at all because these categories are foisted on us at birth, and we may need to make strategic and tactical choices about reacting to them simply to create room to breathe. But as an ideal, I think we could do worse than trying to avoid cislation. So if we're asking, do we need less data, more data, or different data, then perhaps the best response is a counter question: who is we? Thank you.
Just one second before I give you the floor. I really like the fact that we started with this administrative violence. I think there's also the violence of administrative law. So I don't know, it's administrative law violence or something like this. In a completely unrelated panel this morning, somebody was saying that data is always institutional data, or are always institutional data. And I think it's nice to think also of personal data as institutional personal data, and somehow gender data is somewhere there. That's my little thinking. In the meantime, and Kevin, you have the floor.
Hello, hello.
There are slides, so please.
There we go, bright pink. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Gloria, for that introduction, and Alex and Jens for your reflections on this topic. So what I'm going to do with my contribution is a bit of a deep dive. I'm going to look at the counting of trans and non-binary people in Scotland's 2022 national census. And I think this will be quite a nice prelude to Kirsty's work in Scotland as well. So just to say a bit about what's happened in Scotland in recent years. So the census, which is actually ongoing at the moment, added 2 new voluntary questions on sexual orientation and a question described as trans status or history. And this is in addition to an existing compulsory question on binary sex. So in my contribution, I want to share 3 insights from my experiences of work on Scotland's census in the past few years. So my kind of first insight, if I push this button, there we go. My first insight is designed out of an inclusive project. So the inclusion of some LGBTQ people in the census was not a straightforward success story. Although Scotland's census now counts those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, it continues to exclude many individuals who sit under the wider LGBTQ+ umbrella, most notably requiring non-binary people to identify their sex as either male or female. Now, this sex question is compulsory, and failure to answer the sex question can result in a fine of up to £1,000. The sex question we have in Scotland's 2022 census could have been so different. Back in 2017, which feels like a lifetime ago, Scotland's National Statistics Office supported changing the question in the census to present 3 options: male, female, and other, with a write-in box. So these, as I mentioned, this is the organisation responsible for delivery of the census, and after an extensive amount of research, they argued that a non-binary sex question would enable people who neither identify exclusively as male nor female to accurately record themselves in the national count. However, contrary to this extensive research, the committee in the Scottish Parliament, which has ultimate oversight of the census, voted on whether or not to change the question and make it non-binary. They voted against this and argued for the continuation of a binary question. So I want you to think about how this turn of events exposes a tension between the collection of census data as an exercise in knowledge construction versus the protection of status quo identity categories that make sense to those in positions of power. And this committee was was fully cisgender, assumedly heterosexual, making decisions about questions which disproportionately impacted these communities. Scotland's census demonstrates how increased visibility of certain LGBTQ communities can contribute to pushing other LGBTQ lives further into the shadows. And as Scotland's most inclusive census, the task of calling for better representation of non-binary, trans, and other queer identities becomes harder, as existing institutions can now point towards the inclusive addition of new questions on sexual orientation and trans status or history. So my second insight, there we go, was around the census as a future threat to queer communities. So as a gay man completing the census, I was kept awake at night with concerns about being complicit in a data exercise that might inflict future harm on LGBTQ communities. So let me say more about this. So in the UK, there's actually 3 different censuses across different parts of the UK. And in England and Wales, which had its census in 2021, an anti-trans campaign group took the organisation responsible for the census to court and successfully argued in court that respondents should answer the sex question in the census according to the sex on their birth certificate. So the fallout of this court decision, which happened actually while the census was running, has entrenched data collection practices across the UK about gender and sex that are more narrow, more invasive, and more exclusionary. I also couldn't shake off the worry that the presentation of data from the census about the size of the LGBTQ communities might serve the interests of our opponents. For example, what if in a year's time when we see the census data, it says that the population of the UK or of Scotland of LGBT people is 1%, whereas we previously imagined this to be, say, 5% or 6%. What are the trickle-down implications of a small percentage in terms of public attitudes, in terms of resource allocation, and in terms of the provision of LGBTQ-specific services? Scotland's census has actually been extended by a month. It's running at the moment due to a low level of responses. And this might further hamper the counting of queer communities and lead to a differential undercount. And I can say more about that during the Q&A. As documented in population-level studies of race in the US, available data tends to overrepresent the views of individuals who have historically been privileged in the context or environment under investigation. So through my participation, had I given legitimacy to a data collection exercise that might ultimately come back and bite us? And thirdly, I was trying to think where is a kind of data protection hook or angle here with my research in this space. And my third insight was around protection from data. So as we expand the amount of data collected about trans and non-binary communities, we need to reconfigure ideas about data protection to also include protection from data. So as I observed in my work in Scotland around the census, the participation of LGBTQ communities in data projects that fail to improve the lives of all LGBTQ people makes it harder to push against institutions. Participation also gives credibility to a project that can produce data that strengthens the hand of those opposed to the provision of LGBTQ funding and services. So reconfiguring our analysis to think about protection from data poses the question, who needs to be protected and from whom do they require protection? So hopefully across all 3 of these insights, you can see how I found myself assessing the link between queer communities and institutional systems. Are they fit for purpose? Are they capable of reform? Or do we need to rip them up and start again? And in terms of data protection and regulations, can they address the potential harms to groups and collectives as potentially demonstrated by the use of census data? So I want us to depart from the idea that we need more or better data about LGBTQ communities as our starting point for action. We also need to expand and adopt an expanded intersectional analysis of queer fairness to illuminate existing gaps. And as I write about in my book, Queer Data, efforts to accumulate more and more data can inflict harm upon the communities under investigation that they claim to serve, and in fact move us further away from advancing queer liberation for all.
Thank you very much. And we move to Christy, who has also slides. Talk, talk. Hello, hello. Slides? Hello. Maybe they will appear. You start talking and they will appear.
All right, okay. I'll just start talking.
Maybe.
So the title, the first title slide was meant to be the aspirational future of trans data. And by an aspirational future, I would mean I consider a future in which trans people are involved in that production of knowledge about themselves that was being discussed previously. So actively being considered in the design process of how we ask about gender. And I would also say that this should apply to any marginalised group that could potentially be at risk by providing information about themselves. They should be actively involved in the design process of for designing survey questions. So I'm going to really briefly go through how I've approached this in my research. So I've used an exploratory sequential mixed methods design, which basically means I've done lots of different little bits and they all inform each other, and that I am mostly exploring the subject, trying to provide a snapshot on the issues. So I started off by reviewing the current survey practices in the UK. I looked at 27 surveys conducted since 2011, which is when the last censuses prior to the current ones were conducted. And from that, I identified 4 key overlooked groups, which were trans people, non-binary people as a subset of trans people, intersex people, and anyone who does not identify as solely heterosexual, straight, bisexual, lesbian or gay. And I also found that most of the surveys in the UK tend to feature binary questions. They tend to use the language of sex without any sort of explanation of what they mean by sex. They often, if they do offer another option, they don't like specify. There was only one of the surveys I looked at like specify, and there was also very little representation of trans status or gender modality as it's referred to by Florence Ashley, which basically just means the relationship between your sex sign at birth and your gender. From there, I engaged with the overlooked groups and basically asked them via focus groups, what do you think of survey representation? Do you want to be represented? Do you think that's important? And if so, how? In the focus groups, the participants had the opportunity to co-produce questions that they felt would represent people who were overlooked in the same way as them. And the benefit of, so I take a sort of feminist standpoint, and anyone who knows feminist methodologies will be like, why didn't you use interviews? And use focus groups because I wanted them to think of and to have that sort of communication with each other about what would work for everyone there, rather than just what would work for an individual. Being part of an overlooked group myself, it's all well and good me going, oh, I'd answer that question, that'd be great, but that's not going to work for everyone. And then the final strand, I took those questions and shared them with a larger LGBTI plus sample of 347 survey participants. As I said, the samples are still quite small still, but it gave a bit of an insight on if these questions might work. And overall, they were responded to quite favourably. I also got a lot of fantastic text, qualitative responses as well on the survey respondents' perspective on different question designs and why they think they matter. So from there, so on this issue of should we be asking more, less, or for different data, so overall, given that my participants agreed to participate in research, we're not going to be representing the perspectives of people who don't want any data collected, obviously. They were quite favourable of being represented in surveys. However, there was some caveats to this. So the first quote by Avery, which is an anonymised name, obviously, is about sex assigned at birth data, emphasising that it shouldn't be asked about outside of medical situations, was the general consensus across both the focus groups and the surveys of my research, was that sex assigned at birth data is mostly relevant in medical situations and it has less relevance in other situations. There was also some discussion about medical data, about sex assigned at birth data being a bit too broad as well, and maybe you might need more specific data in certain situations depending on the context and what the medical need might be. And then the quote from Joe here is about how gender is often asked in situations where it is not needed. So although I was focusing on population surveys, my participants didn't really have a sort of separation in their minds between a question for a supermarket card or a question for the census. To them, they just get asked a lot of different questions about gender all the time. They're just bombarded with them, and in most cases, they did not seem to have any relevance. And there was this general focus on the fact that participants needed to know why the data was being collected and for what purpose and how it was going to be used to feel comfortable disclosing that information. Is this working? Yeah, okay. So moving on to the notion of different data. So as I said, for the most part, my participants were in favour of being represented by surveys. They saw it as important to them. And here's an example of how that is prevented. So this is a participant from the survey who said that they would actually prefer to say about their identity, but there's just not an option for them. And that's what my research tends to look at, the preventative issues with these survey designs, like when there is just not a box for someone to tick, as is the case for the Scottish Census, which has the binary sex question. There's just not a box for people like myself to tick. I'm going to look into how my participants thought we could address some of these issues. So these were 2 questions designed by my focus group participants, and I also shared with the survey participants. So the benefits of these questions. So the first one is a gender question. So I want us to have the caveat that the wording of these questions could change likely and will be very context dependent, but the main benefits of them are that it's a tick however many apply question. One of the big issues my participants found was that even if there was an expansive list of options, even if they could say they were non-binary, or if they could write in the text box another gender identity, they might be limited from selecting that and another option. And for people who were gender fluid or related to the identities of man and woman, along with another identity, that was a barrier. I'll go into some data surrounding that in a moment. There was also the inclusion of a text box, which was seen as particularly important and was really emphasised throughout, because regardless of how many options are listed, the best way to record gender is to just get people to write it in their own words, which obviously comes with limitations when we are looking at larger scale quantitative data collection, but paired with an expansive list of options, this seems like a good compromise to me personally. And then there was the prefer not to say option, should be included, as having the option to disclose information about gender or gender modality was seen as key here. My participants discussed disclosure in the surveys as coming out and having the significance of coming out. So even amongst these participants who were generally quite positive about survey representation, they still saw the risks in this, and they still saw the danger in it, and they still saw the importance of being asked to provide information rather than being told you must provide information. There's also the benefit here of gender and gender modality being asked about separately. The key benefit here is one, that it doesn't create sort of misconstrued, sort of hierarchical claims about trans people. So occasionally you will see questions that have the options. They'll say tick one box, and it'll be man, woman, trans woman, inherently separating out trans people from cis people without using the word cis. So it's making value claims about who is who. Not great. Or you'll have ones that have man, woman, trans is just another option in which people cannot specify important information. The other benefit here that my participants recognised was that you could choose what information to disclose in this situation. So someone might be comfortable disclosing their specific gender, but not going into if they're trans or not. And then, so the point about having the sex assigned at birth language versus the trans status language, that was something that my participants personally saw as significant, because not all non-binary people will identify with the term trans. However, I would say that that's very context dependent, and they did respond favourably to the trans status question in the Scottish Census, which comes with a definition of what is meant by trans, which is a non-binary inclusive definition. So that's mostly a point there about recognising the complexities surrounding the language that we use, and maybe not using identity categories so much in the question, the actual question option. And also just like having, if you have categorical variables, put them in alphabetical order, then you miss out any sort of weird like value judgment. The amount of times I see heterosexual first on a list for no particular reason. Why is it there? Why is it first? So that's the general approach. And the last thing I'm just going to look at is why that having tick more than one box option is important. So this is from my survey, and it's basically breaking down the gender options that my participants selected when given an expansive list. And what it also shows is who selected more than one option when they were provided with the choice to do so. So if they were not provided with more than one option, then 170 of my 347 participants would have been partly overlooked. So a part of their identity would be overlooked by the data. And 131 would be completely overlooked because they did not fit in to binary categories, which are the categories that are normally selected, that are normally provided. So this is just emphasising the sort of what we're talking about the depth of data. And to be honest, there's still limits in what a survey design can do. But if we're wanting to get data that is accurate rather than sort of comfortable for cis people, then allowing people to select from a more expansive list of options, provide text data, is the direction that we should be going in. But yeah, I also very much agree though with the risks of data in these cases, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it more. So yeah, that's.
Thank you very much. In 1 second, we will open the floor for questions. But before, I wanted to come back to Alex. Because I think you all have shown this basic dilemma. Collecting data, is it good, is it bad? It depends on how you do it. And a specific context in which we are regularly or often discussing this is in the context of AI, and especially in the fight against bias. You know? They say you have to be careful when you collect sensitive data, be careful in general, but if you're collecting sensitive data because you don't want to be biased, then go ahead, go wild, you can collect everything because it's for a good cause and then everything is fine. What will be your views? And we will perhaps start there. Is it just a good idea? Is it, again, a bad idea? I would like to hear from you.
Right, so this is a great question. Thinking about bias, I think people are like, oh, let's collect some kind of data on gender and have this, to assess for bias. So, I mean, one, I want to start off every time we talk about bias, I want to say, one, there's no unbiased data set, right? Let's just put that right here, right? Data is biased, all data is biased. Acknowledging what that bias is the first place to start. Second, debiasing, whatever that means, is not going to make this data any less violent for whatever purpose it may be. So if you have something that is even let's say you debias a data set that is going into some model or an embedding, is there an embedding space or something, it really matters what holistically those outcomes are coming to be, and what that matters much more than this specific data set. But talking about the sort of process of thinking about collecting data or having this, what I want to highlight is sort of coming to a gender classification in such a way to assess for bias in such a way that may be violent in the process. And so, for instance, this comes up, for instance, when it comes to automated gender recognition itself. So, there was a case this is a kind of a case in kind of industry work in which, there's a particular product team that was like, oh, we need to use automated gender recognition to assess, bias. I'm like, no, you don't. First off, that's bullshit. Second off, because that process in itself is that you're doing one, you're imposing a categorization on a body of images in which gender cannot be recognized from this kind of perceived view. Two, if you're doing that in such a way, that itself is going to produce a sort of erasure of non-binary, any kind of non-binary identity. It is going to perpetuate bias and violences via this trans and gender non-conforming people. And work that, for instance, Working Class Showerman, his collaborator of mine, has done. One of his results in looking at automated gender recognition systems is one, systematically misgender trans people, but then more importantly, there's a fundamental illegibility in classifying agender, non-binary people. And so starting from that perspective, saying we need to have these kind of perspectives or do this kind of classification for a debiasing procedure, the only way you get those data is through self-identification. And self-identification is already going to have extreme limits if your N sizes for non-binary, trans people, agender people, genderqueer people is that small, and so that disaggregation itself becomes a vector for harm. So that's, yeah, general discussion on bias.
Yeah, I guess I can add something. So my work is mainly in equality and diversity work with UK universities, so kind of initiatives, programs, schemes to try and address broader equality and diversity issues. And I think in that space, bias is an attractive proposal, or this idea of addressing bias appeals to senior leaders, appeals to managers. It seems like a solution to the problem. And I think in my work, what I'm concerned about is this kind of easy fix to the problem can often attract and use a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy, that's actually often distracting from the real source of the problem, which often for equality and diversity issues is structural change, change at the grassroots level to actually reform or overhaul institutions. And in my work, unconscious bias training or kind of tweaking the existing system often isn't enough. So increasingly in my work, I find myself, I think, despondent as an answer to the problem, in that it's often pushing more meaningful solutions further into the distance and actually distracting us from what should be our real focus, which is actually getting at the root of the system, the root of the problem, to change systems or to question whether systems can be reformed, can be changed. And if they can be, then arguing for their abolition. And I think increasingly this kind of unconscious bias training or anti-bias fixes often kind of belie the real challenges.
Thank you very much. I would really like to hear from the audience if you have questions, or are you all sleeping? I see one here. Not sleeping? Good, good.
Hi, thanks for the panel, and I'll get straight to the question. So I would really like to hear your gender perspective on fair machine learning, and I think you kind of just touched on it, the problems a bit there. And specifically, so there's the gender data gap, and which collecting that data would obviously be a problem, right? As you just talked about, protection from data. And so the solution people come up with is fairness measures, which these constraints are just often mathematical representations of different fairness policies in society. And even if we use them, maybe people that come from, all right, so if the data is biased and is only collected about like white male men, they're the ones, even if you have a fairness constraints, they're the one that would benefit from the causal link, right, between the data set and the objective. So what do you think about this?
I have many thoughts on this. I mean, one is that, you know, like the kind of impositions of fairness as a system, you know, reflect into, you know, a particular sort of interpretation of legal constraints and in fairness. And given the very US-centric notion of fairness, it stems from a very particular sort of stemming of anti-discrimination law. Anti-discrimination law, and this is me totally just stealing Anna Lauren Hoffman's argument, so whatever, stop me if you've heard it before. And you know, her argument being that, you know, like one, anti-discrimination law has single axis thinking, you know, you only ask by gender, you know, you don't have, they use the metaphor of intersections from Crenshaw and mostly in kind of you just, add race and gender and ability and whatever, and then you stir, not considering that these discriminations are not symmetric, but they are multiplicative, right? They're qualitatively different. You cannot have discrimination but for being a black woman compared to being a white male. There's those intersections in which they're compounding, right? So one, fairness falls into that trap. Two, the kind of fairness, then, well, that's I think, that's the main one I want to go into. So I mean, there's that. I would say that insofar as the sort of data gap, like, I'm not saying that we don't want to have data collected on people in terms of it, and I think insofar as data is collected in such a way that we do have this gap, and there's, I have a hard time speaking about this in a very restricted way, because thinking about it when you're talking about this in sort of general allows you to sort of say, yes, we need more data in this certain domain, but if you're not thinking about what the data is and what the sort of holistic arc of the modeling and the outcomes are, then it becomes sort of a practice in organizations being allowed to accrue more resources for a particular end. So for instance, for instance, Gender Shades as a study by Joy Bulamwini and Tanija Brew. Tanit's my boss, so I can say this. There's a limited in the article, the auto essentialization article, which is referenced earlier. Thank you for that's very kind of you. but one of the criticisms, you can have a broad critique of how these data are used and a narrow critique. The narrow critique is, let's get more data for black women in this. Soon after the article was published at FAT 2018, Joy said on stage, we collected this, IBM collected this and fixed this, right? IBM then was sued under the Biometric Illinois Privacy Act, under BIPA, under the creation of the diversity of faces data set, which was collected from Flickr under Creative Commons licensing, but because BIPA more closely reflects data subject consent that's closer to GDPR, and it's weird being in this conference. I don't know much about GDPR, so I shouldn't admit that on stage. But then they were sued under the provisions of that act. A more broad conception of that is understanding, and this is reflected in Joy's spoken word work, in which especially the AI anti-woman work, which is focusing on the systematic misgendering of black women and connecting that to broader systems of dehumanization that exist in sort of photography and recognition. And so in the abstract, there's a real limit to what that collection of data exists at. And at the limit then, you really have to get beyond the abstraction of fairness towards what the goal and the outcomes of the systems are and which rights those violate.
Thank you very much. I'm looking if there are more questions already. Yes, here you were there, but we'll come here eventually.
Hi, thanks a million for the fantastic presentation so far. Just to kind of follow up on this dynamic of the response to the criticisms not being good and kind of leading to more problematic things, I want to bring up the problem of synthetic data. Because when we push back on the collection of data to kind of equalize representation in data sets, the solution that's proposed seems to be, okay, well, we'll use generative models to make synthetic data sets, and thereby we don't have to collect data about people, but we can, improve the representation to this. But it seems to me that generative models are still trained on unrepresentative data sets, so their ability to then produce new representative data is also limited. So, yeah, do you have thoughts on the ability of synthetic data to be a solution there, or is it equally undermined for those reasons?
how do you include people into synthetic data? I don't know.
I would say, so what you were saying there about it being based on not representative data, that's the main issue. But there's also the issue of the fluidity of identity and the changing of identities over time. So if we have synthetic data based off previous sample, then it's just going to recreate this perception of gender from that time in place in that specific context. Although there is issues with collecting data from individuals, if there's a need to collect it, then that's different, then we should be collecting it. But synthetic data doesn't address that issue either. The issues, well, for me personally, the issue is more sometimes that we don't need more data of any sort to contribute to the issues. It's we are already very aware of what the issues are. It's a matter of political will often that's the issue.
I can add something. I can't speak specifically to synthetic data, but I am intrigued at the moment about the question of outness and to what extent outness is a prerequisite of LGBTQ data, which is the broader space I work in. And if it is a prerequisite of collecting that data, even if it's just outing yourself in a survey form or a diversity monitoring form in your work, if outness is a prerequisite, then what sort of data set are we creating? And some of my work, recent work, has been around kind of global data collection practices, so kind of global universities, global businesses, global employers, when they're surveying their staff or their service users. Again, what kind of Western ideas about outness are we presupposing or are we kind of embedding in these businesses, in these universities, and in these institutions? And I think kind of unteasing outness from LGBTQ data is quite challenging, but I think it's something for us to think about, that kind of relationship between the two. It doesn't speak exactly to synthetic data, but I do think it builds on Kirsty's idea of fluidity and the challenges of establishing that data set.
Thank you. Perhaps we can collect a couple of questions here in the front. I see some people. Here. Here, in the first. Sorry.
Thank you. So I'm Sarah Eskens, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I had a question for you, Jens, because you were talking about these binary categorizations, and I was wondering to what extent can the law help to push back against this drive to binary categorizations? And you already, I think, gave an example of a German law which gives you the option to cross some kind of other gender option. You yourself have a background in human rights law, which of course enables you to change the categorization, but not necessarily push back against any categorization. So could you think of other things? I myself was already thinking of purpose limitation. I think that addresses some of the quotes that we saw in Christie's study, but yeah, maybe also other options still.
We were collecting just maybe another question, and it's quicker. Good.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you for a very, very inspiring series of talks. So, from what I understand from some of your perspectives, inclusivity and inclusion isn't the aim and isn't always desirable, right? You spoke a lot about resistance and non-collection and so on. At an infrastructural or like a structural level, what does trans computation or trans or queer ICT infrastructure look like? What is, like going beyond resistance, where do we go from there?
Good. Yes, perhaps a final question, and then we have more time.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was very cool. So I have more of a meta question about the discourse about this. So I'm like kind of in the chair between like machine learning and social sciences, and I feel like this discourse about gender or like intersectionality is not like arriving in the tech academia space, to put it this way, or maybe not even academia, but maybe the tech space. And the other way around, maybe the technological knowledge is not arriving in like the social sciences space. And I mean, it's 2022, and I would really like love to see more. And I don't know, maybe you've like some thoughts, or what are your thoughts on this, or guidelines, or hints, or I don't know. I'm just feeling lost sometimes there.
Good, but we are here. That's the good news. That's not so bad. Perhaps Jens.
Yeah. So thank you very much for those questions. So the question of law and categorizations, I have to say that, I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I'm at this point very, very skeptical as to the emancipatory potential of law at all. I mean, in this specific context, but also more broadly for that matter. So returning to the German legal system, which I think right now is not necessarily the most progressive, depending on which standards we're applying there, but definitely one of the only legal systems worldwide which has a third gender option at all. And it sometimes gets held up as this kind of like gold standard. I'm often invited to kind of like conferences on non-binary rights where people are like, oh, you're from Germany, like, so you can, you can tell us how it should be done. And I'm like, that's not what I'm going to be saying in my presentation. Like, I'm sorry to disappoint you. So even in the good cases, like if you don't start from law, but rather start from kind of trans experience, then there's so much to be desired. And that goes for human rights law as well, maybe even more so. I mean, there's relatively few kind of human rights judgments or documents, at least legally binding ones, on the issue so far. There is going to be a case before the European Court of Human Rights sometime soon. I'm very, very, very skeptical as to whether that will have a good outcome for a variety of reasons. So again, even just on that level of moving beyond the binary at all, like there is so much pushback, and then moving in whichever way beyond categorization, which of course is difficult in general because we all think so much in categorizations, but the law even more so, right? In a sense, law is all about making categories. Like the foundational divide between kind of lawful, unlawful is essentially like a binary category, right? And that gets, that turns up in all kind of contexts. So yeah, I can't really say that I'm that optimistic. We can, of course, we can try other creative routes. One could think about trying to use the GDPR, for example. I'll wrap up in a moment, no problem. And there may be some creative potential there, but I think it's always going to be these very, very small scale victories with a lot of kind of downsides to them as well. On the meta level discourse, I would just very briefly say, I mean, could go in loads of directions, but seek out the few people who do kind of think similarly. That's where you get your strength from. Like, that's my experience, at least. Like, I always feel like I end up running up against walls all the time, no matter which context. So it's just kind of important to gather your energy somewhere. That would be the one kind of hint, I guess.
Kirsty, you have 2 minutes to reply to something.
Okay, so on the point about like what we're kind of saying about how like just adding an extra box isn't enough and isn't helpful. There's various ways that this manifests, but there's an example recently from the UK. So to sign up for a COVID vaccine in Scotland, you were able to do like early registration at one point, but when doing this, they provided an option to state that you were not male or female. Fantastic, great, wonderful. However, if you selected that option, you could not register for a vaccine because the gender question there was how they found your medical records, because the entire medical, all the NHS records are based on a binary system using chi numbers. So there's a broader sort of infrastructural issue when it comes to gender about the binary nature and the binary assumption of gender. So to actually to challenge some of the issues, you have to kind of to pick apart that first to actually make a difference. And also for the thing about the question about the tech and social sciences and vice versa. So I'm trained in sociology, but with advanced quantitative methods. But the fact that that's a very new element, like I was the first at my university to get that degree, we're miles away from, like, I do think more training is the way to go, but like my data literacy isn't great, like it's fine, like I can do some stuff, but it's not nearly as advanced as I'd want it to be, but I'm still miles ahead of most other just social science graduates who will not touch anything with numbers. I'll finish.
Good. Kevin, 2 minutes.
Okay, wow. I'll speak the final two questions. I think they're really big questions, but really exciting questions, and speaks to my experiences and the challenges in my work as well. So the question around how do we kind of go beyond resistance or go beyond refusal, and kind of where do we go from here? I think that's the million-dollar question at the moment. And in my work, in my writing, I don't provide answers, unfortunately. I think we're not quite at the stage yet to build something new. I think the stage we're at is actually trying to challenge the existing systems, the existing institutions, and being that voice in the room who's asking those challenging questions, which can be difficult, to be that contrarian voice, to kind of go, why are we doing it this way? Why are we collecting data? Why are we spending £10,000 on this new piece of research when actually we know enough about the problem? So I think what I'd encourage you to do now is just being that kind of annoying voice in the room who's just asking those challenging questions, and hopefully from that we can build something better. And then the final question, again, really spoke to my experience. My background is in history, it's in gender history, it is not in data particularly. My training is in archives and qualitative materials. But having done that as my kind of academic training and then working outside of academia for 5 years and then coming back to it quite recently, it's been a huge, huge strength. And I think my work is kind of based in the space of queer studies, but very much around quantitative methods. And I think having that kind of dual hat on is a real strength, and I think your voice will be really valuable in that room if you're able to speak to a wide range of backgrounds across different sectors and disciplines. So best of luck with that, and I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. Alex?
Yeah, I'll start with the last question. I love this way Kevin responded, thinking about the intersection, but also not valorizing one particular field, because my PhD is in sociology, and I think sociology, and I have a paper I'm working on this, has a serious transmisogyny problem. There's not actually a really good way in which sociology as a field actually has dealt with intersectionality, transmisogyny, and transmisogynoir, and those are deeply embedded in the discipline for the way that sex and gender are talked about. And so there needs to be a bit of cleaning of house for my own field before it really encounters social science, and I think a lot of that has to be interrogating and interfacing with trans studies, queer studies, and understanding where those divisions are. And the question about what is a trans or queer computing, I also don't have answers, but I would point you to sort of histories that exist. You mentioned Mara Hicks's work, which is in the sort of historical, but I would also point to the work of Jacob Gabori, who has written about figures in queer computing and reconstituting, thinking about reconstituting figures like Alan Turing is not separate from his sexuality, but integral to his own, thoughts on computation. Cass Adar's work on kind of a queer and trans history of IBM and the labor embedded throughout and how that entails our rethinking. It seems like these are figures that have always been sort of against sort of a particular sort of computing, but in the sense of we can sort of learn about mistakes or entrapments or envisionings that they had and kind of relearn and rework that. And I think trans art and artistic practice really points as a way forward there. So I, kind of thinking about, oops, be careful. So I some of the work from Misha Carditas, for instance, in Transcolor of Critique and Trans of Color Poetics has been one place that I've been focusing on, as well as trans literature, as also another place of inspiration.
Thank you very much. With this, I think we didn't talk about rights at all. Before we were talking about complaining and the importance of complaint, and you say something here about complaining. I think that's perhaps, when you go and buy the book, you can read the part about complaint. Complaints are also very important, but we are perfectly on time, so I just would like to thank very much the audience for being here, and thank all the speakers for being here. And next year there will be another gender panel. If you have great ideas, very, very important issues about gender that you want to discuss, tell me and we will make it. Thank you.